All right, fans. Welcome to another edition of our Rock Show Critique podcast here. And today we've got a special guest here, like we usually always do. But this time we're bringing in author Christopher P. Hilton. Welcome.
Hey, Joe, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on the show. Much appreciated.
So you wrote this book called,
Yes.
as you can see in the picture back there in your background. That's awesome. The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal, and an era not to be forgotten. So, what spawned this whole thing for you to write this book?
Well, I mean, as you said, the book's about, the genre of 80s based hard rock. You can call it glam metal, hair metal, heavy metal, pop rock, whatever you want. We'll get into that, I'm sure. The book uses the term hair metal for better or worse. I'm not a fan if you've read the book. But the book tries to chronicle basically, the three-part story arc. This music and these bands had really a sensational rise to prominence and domination, and then kind of a spectacular car crash of a fall in the early to mid 90s, at least commercially, to almost extinction, and then a resurrection and a rebirth towards the turn of the century to be sustained, certainly if less commercially and culturally prominent, to at least something where the bands are still out there, they're still touring, and the book aims to tell really the stories the bands were going through, the madness, the excess, the fallout in the 90s, the tales behind the music. What I really wanted to do was create, if you've ever seen the VH1 behind the music specials that focus on a particular band, I wanted to do something like that in writing for the entire genre. And really tried to cover a wide spectrum of bands. I mean, there's a lot of pages devoted to the platinum sellers for sure, but also wanted to include a lot of the B and C tier bands, or even the D and E tier bands. As far as writing it, I'm a huge fan of the genre. For better or worse, this is probably the only thing I'm even remotely qualified to have an expert opinion on. I've read just about everything there is to possibly read about hair metal, and there's so many impressive individual pieces of writing out there every day. Something as small as a news post or an album review to a band interview, all the way up through just wonderful books and autobiographies by people like Slash, or everybody's read Motley Crue's The Dirt. But I never saw one book, at least at that time, at least the time I wrote it, that was dedicated to the genre itself. It was all about one band or one piece of music or one album, and I just thought it was a heck of a story, right? The rise, the fall, the rebirth. Everybody likes a good story. It was kind of the book I always wish someone else would write so I could read it. But one day I thought, hey, let's give it a shot here and see if we can give the fans something that not only takes them on a little bit of a nostalgia trip backwards, but a lot of this music was in a non-internet age. Today, you know everything about your favorite artists, but there's still some stories out there to tell, that didn't necessarily make it to the Metal Edge or Circus magazine at the time. So I thought people could get a good background for some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. And, fans of this kind of music, we love to immerse ourselves in it. So just thought it'd be something fun to do, and it's worked out really well.
So, how long did it actually take you to write it once you decided to go full steam ahead on it?
The actual duration wasn't that long. It was about 18 months, but the time was pretty intense. Unfortunately, I have a full-time day job besides writing the book. So I would normally put in maybe 2 or 3 hours a weekday, but on the weekends, I would spend, 6 to 8 hours each weekend day, which sounds crazy. I mean, there's more than 1,000 hours that went into this book. But it was really a labor of love, and I really wanted it to be something, worth putting out there. I wanted it to be complete and robust, and so it was, like I said, it was over 1,000 hours, but I'm glad I did it. I was also happy to finish it once it was done.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's really a long book, over 400 pages. I like how you started off by taking it chronologically, basically from the beginning of where you feel that the genre kind of started. Obviously, like you said, there's so many. If they read the first chapter, then they'll know your take on this whole hair metal thing. But yeah, because I mean, there's a lot of bands in here that you didn't really bring up that for whatever reason, you felt that they just weren't classified as hair metal. They were more maybe just metal, which you didn't really bring up, a lot of metal bands. You kind of just kept it more towards the commercial type bands.
Yeah, you may be surprised. I mean, the book is big, right? 450 pages is a lot for even the most hardcore hair metal fans. But you may be surprised. The first draft was almost 900 pages. I
Oh,
knew nobody wanted to read that, but the initial goal was to put all the bands in there, right, and to give everyone the press they deserve. But you just couldn't, right? You had to narrow it down somehow. No one's going to read a 900-page book. And anyone who's read the book, the very first sentence of the very first chapter says, "I got a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal because I do, and I hate it in the sense that a lot of people, especially in the '90s, now it's more of a nostalgic, happy term for at least some segment of the population. But it was a derogatory term, and most people today, if you're a little younger, you might be surprised to know that the term hair metal wasn't even invented until years after the genre's heyday. Generally considered to be 1985, 1986, all the way up through 1991. Up until that point, it was all heavy metal. Bands like Poison and Warrant in 1989 were considered heavy metal. There was no hair metal. There might have been some people using the term pop metal, but what I really want to do is be clear to the audience as to what bands you were talking about. And as much as I hated to use the term, I thought, hey, this is the best way to communicate what this book is about. And if you think about, like the radio station, like Sirius radio station, Hair Nation. If someone says Hair Nation, you know what you're going to get, right? You're going to get Poison, Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Warrant, Skid Row, Guns N' Roses, et cetera, et cetera. And you can make a lot of arguments as to why the majority of those bands don't belong in the hair metal category. I've generally found there's like four groups of people that have a view on this phrase. The first group would say, hey, every rock band from the 80s with long hair was hair metal. Okay, and that is the most broad spectrum. The second group says, okay, it's all hair metal from the 80s rock, except for like the real, to your point, heavy metal bands like Metallica or Megadeth or Slayer. So it's easy to parse out that group. But then there's like a third taxonomy that gets even more restrictive. And the first bands that get thrown out of hair metal in this category are usually Van Halen or Aerosmith, even Guns N' Roses, right? Because Van Halen and Aerosmith, they're really 70s bands, and people would say, Guns N' Roses were too real or too authentic, or they didn't dress the same way as bands did in 1985. People will even throw out Def Leppard because really they were part of the new wave of British heavy metal, weren't really part of that whole Sunset Strip thing. But then there's a fourth group of people. I can fall in this group in any day of the week too, that would conjure up all kinds of defenses as to why none of these bands should be hair metal. Skid Row, they were too heavy, or Whitesnake was just really a late 70s blues band, which is pretty much true. Winger was more of a progressive rock band, or Faster Pussycat or LA Guns. This is more sleaze rock. And okay, White Lion, well, they had political terms, songs, like When the Children Cry or Cry for Freedom, and they can't possibly be hair metal. You can go on and on and on. There's a few bands you'd be hard pressed to make an argument for, but at the end of the day, it's all the music people generally loved from that era, regardless of what label you put on it or what bands were different than others. So I said, hey, we're gonna put a title on this thing, as much as it pained me to do so. And trust me, I've heard from some people who won't touch this book with a 10-foot pole because I said, how dare you call my favorite band hair metal? And trust me, I get it. I really do. I hate the term. So it was kind of between a rock and a hard place.
yeah. Some bands you must have been. Should I include them? Should I not? Like I would say, Queensryche is one that's you're probably on the fence with.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Right.
because they started kind of off toward a little bit of a glam type similar, and then obviously they changed a little bit, a lot as a lot of bands do.
Well, even in 1990, right? I mean, the average, heavy metal fan at the time, there was no difference between an album like Empire and an album like Dr. Feelgood to the casual fan, right? Now I'm offending some people by saying there's no difference between those two records because we know there is, but it was all the same at that time. But yeah, I had to cut the line at some point. I tried to, generally, if you hear it on Hair Nation, it's in the book with some exceptions. Not that I use that as my North Star. I didn't.
Exactly. Now, you really go into full details, and I like how you include a lot of stuff later in the later years for the Rebirth era and everything. Now, let's get into the actual fall here. Now,
Okay.
obviously you say a lot in here, but what I want to know, because you don't really go into this much detail, what I want to know is if what three things do you think? could have saved this from totally collapsing the way it did, if there were such things? What would you say would be the three things that would probably have at least kept things alive, or more, more, a little bit more at a mainstream for this type of music without totally dropping off the face of the earth?
Well, I mean, the very first thing that comes to mind is the music industry itself and MTV, right? I mean, at the time, even when grunge came out or alternative music, there was a place for both of them until there wasn't. I remember in 1991, I went to see Van Halen in concert and Alice in Chains opened, and it was all hard rock and heavy metal, and we were all happy, right? But MTV in particular told the public, you're going to have to choose because we're only going to do one or the other. I don't think it necessarily had to be that way, and the whole what caused the downfall is a subject of much debate and pontification to begin with. The popular phrase is that grunge killed hair metal, or Nirvana killed hair metal. You'll hear that more specifically. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it is certainly not the whole truth. I was talking to a guy just the other day who took a different take and said, well, I think Guns N' Roses killed hair metal. And he wasn't wrong either, because that was a different kind of music versus what you heard in 1985, and a different look as well. But as far as putting everything into a more homogenized group, I generally feel that grunge was more in the right place at the right time. Certainly the market was becoming saturated. There was, for lack of a better term, some copycatting out there. There was a formula that got stale. There was only so much demand versus an infinitely growing amount of supply, right? Immediately in 1990, you had bands, you had Firehouse and Trickster and Steelheart and Roxy Blue and Nelson, and I could go on and on and on. And these are all wonderful artists, right? Very talented folks, but they weren't exactly reinventing the wheel. Bands had already sort of started to change their sound long before grunge came out, long before Nirvana. All right. I mean, Poison that did Flesh and Blood in 1990, that was kind of a step in a different direction. Cinderella that did Heartbreak Station at the same time was a step in a different direction. Slave to the Grind, Skid Row had really nothing to do with hair metal. Love that album. Even the Use Your Illusions albums by Guns N' Roses didn't have the same 1986, 1985, slippery when wet type of hair metal feel. But grunge was the tipping point, but I think it was a social thing as well, right? Grunge was more connected to a generation that was experiencing a distinctly different political and socioeconomic climate versus what was present during hair metal's birth. For people, my age, I'm old, but people that were around in the 80s, the 80s was a time for, tremendous highs and exuberance and excess. And excess is the best word there. I mean, it was just more, bigger, bigger, bigger. How much could you party? The nothing but a good time was literally what the 80s were. But, that changed as we moved into the 90s. Kids felt a sense of angst and alienation and depression. They weren't ready to have nothing but a good time. And grunge felt more real to them, I think. It was the perfect medium if you were angry or you were sad or you're confused or you're depressed and you want to embrace those feelings, and it allowed you to connect. I mean, hair metal offered nothing along those lines. And me personally, I wasn't interested in anything along those lines, but it was more accessible. I think the average teenager in 1992 or 1993, if they went to a Motley Crue show with all the lights and the lasers and the bombastic production, I mean, I think you could appreciate that, but I don't know that you could relate to it, as opposed to when some of these grunge bands got up on stage. They looked like you, they dressed like you. It was a little easier to play in some regards, in terms of, three chords. There was a relatability to there. And I mean, teenagers and rock and roll music has always been about rebellion to a certain extent, right? Rebelling against the norm. And there's nothing rebellious about liking, a music format that's already a commercial king.
Mm-hmm.
As much as Motley Crue was one of the most dangerous bands in the world, they were also one of the most popular commercially best-selling bands in the world in 1990. So, I mean, there was all that. But to your question, I'm sorry, I'm off on a tangent. MTV was what really killed it, because they said, you're not going to have both. We're going to completely move away from one and move to the other. And they really, we like to look back, and in hindsight, you say, well, it was completely overnight that this thing happened. It was not completely overnight, trust me, not as much as history would like us to believe, but it was amazingly fast.
Yeah.
I remember a band like Trickster, right? Generally thought of it as hair metal by almost everybody. If you remember the Dial MTV program that was there in the early 90s, Trickster had 3 straight #1 videos on the Dial MTV program. But then suddenly, when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, And MTV said, nope, we're going to completely shift, and we're going to completely flush away everything that had anything to do, even tangentially, with hair metal. Trickster had the very last #1 video on Dial MTV. Not only did they abolish the format, but Trickster was never played on MTV again, period, not even once. So, I'm not saying that anything could have kept it at that level where, you sell multi-platinum albums with ease, but rock and roll cycles like every 10 years. We all know this. So I think to an extent, hair metal wasn't really built to last. If you think about what it was and the pure nature of it, the tremendous spectacle that these bands grew to really left no room for evolution. At some point there was no room for additional access. How high could you can't sing any higher. You can't play guitar any faster. You can't drink anymore. You can't do any more drugs. You can't put a bigger light show on. So this thing was meant to kind of have an end point possibly anyway. And like I said, grunge was there at the right time. So I think it naturally would have, had a down curve, but I think the industry and MTV is what said, hey, you're going to be gone pretty much overnight. And it was. I think that's what really could have allowed it to have a more gradual curve. But I mean, we'll never know, will we?
Well, I think another thing too was the fact that a lot of your big players, you know, it's like they used to release albums every year, and then as it got towards the late 80s, then they started making albums every 2 years because of touring and everything. And then all of a sudden, once 90, 91 hit, there was big powerhouse groups like Bon Jovi and AC/DC and to name a few, they just didn't make any albums again until 95. So you went all the way from like 90, 91 till 95 without releasing any kind of album, which possibly could have helped, keep things going from one of those major bands, that we love from that era there.
It's true. I mean, in a lot of these bands, by the time they got to 1990, they had been around since a lot of them since the earlier mid 80s, and they were burnt out. As in the 80s, the touring cycle was, as you said, it was get out on tour, stay out on tour for a year, come home, take 2 weeks off, get right back in the studio for maybe 3 months, 4 month tops, and then get right back on the road. Repeat. And you do this 4 or 5 times in some of these bands. I mean, that's a tough lifestyle, even when you're young, to go through for a period of 10 years. So you had solo albums, right? To your point, Bon Jovi, Richie Sambora and John Bon Jovi both went off and did their solo albums. So that put some time between records. Skid Row intentionally, at the urging of their management, I don't know that this was a good idea or a bad idea, they delayed Subhuman Race because they were going to wait till grunge passed. Well, good luck with that, right? I mean, you had to wait a good 10 years as it turned out. But yeah, the output did seem to become, a little less than an album every year. Again, I don't know that that would have necessarily sustained things, but it didn't help, to your point.
Yeah,
And then when
for
the albums
sure.
did came out, right? I mean, the artist changed. The 90s was more of a different kind of truth for a lot of these bands, and the music started to not sound like hair metal, even through hair metal artists. And some of these artists, this was natural evolution and natural change for them, in which case you had to support it, right? They were evolving. Everything evolves. How long can you write stories about, the excess and hedonism of the 80s as you start to, hit your 30s or mid 30s? But, some of the artists instead did it just to try and remain commercially relevant. And, who can blame them, right? This is their gig. This is their lifestyle. And there was a lot of these records out there, right? Warrant put out Ultraphobic and Belly to Belly, and
Mm.
Poison had Native Tongue, and Motley Crue had the self-titled album, which I love, by the way, and Generation Swine. There was all kinds of hair bands making grunge type albums. Danger Danger did Dawn in 1985. These days, by Bon Jovi certainly didn't sound like Slippery When Wet. I mean, you can go on and on and on. We mentioned Subhuman Race, Def Leppard did Slang. We're going to talk about that record later, I'm sure. But there's dozens and dozens of them. And I never really understood in retrospect how the artists thought that was going to work for them. uh, I mean, Warrant putting out a record like Belly to Belly. I mean, let's say they put out in the mid 90s the best grunge alternative album in the history of music. The people that were fans of grunge and alternative music were not going to buy that record because it was called Warrant. We know this. And the fans of Warrant generally weren't fans of that kind of music. So they were serving no master, right? I mean, I don't know who they thought they were going to satisfy by switching the format. And like I said, if it was always in their hearts, then more power to them. If it was an attempt to become or maintain commercial relevance, Again, I'm not saying I would have tried to do a different thing, but it wasn't very successful for the bunch of them, was it?
No. And a lot of bands too, they carried on with the name even after losing some key members. You would think, if they had to do it all over again, maybe some of them would have changed the name of the band.
It was a tough call, right? I mean, I just mentioned that Motley Crue self-titled album in 1994, right? They talked about changing the band's name because that band without Vince Neil was not, what you and I would have known as Motley Crue, and so different band, different music, different name, but at the same time, it's commercial suicide, right? I mean, the record company would never let them put out that record under any other name. There's countless examples of it, of people that tried to move on to a different name, or even when David Coverdale tried to put out the Restless Heart album in the late 90s. He wanted it to be under his name, and the record company said, listen, it's going to be Whitesnake's name because it's got to sell. Or I think they settled on David Coverdale's Whitesnake. Not that the record even got a release in the US because grunge had taken such a foothold in the mid 90s that you couldn't even sell a Whitesnake album. You couldn't even get a record deal for a Whitesnake album in the late 90s, which is almost impossible to believe, right? A band that sold multi millions of records towards the late 80s. But that's what it came down to, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think in that case though, like you said, he was still big overseas, and then that's where they released the album, so they
Yep.
felt their best case scenario to at least try to sell some albums was to keep that name on that album.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So had a U.S. release, who knows? He eventually did release another album under his name solo a couple years later.
Yeah. Into the light, right?
Yep. But yeah, it's just strange. And I love the thing I love about this book is how you go deeper into it, and you mentioned some of these C and D bands and stuff like that. Give me an average hair band fan. Three albums by three different bands that never really made it big that you feel are great albums all the way through.
Um, let's see, underrated albums perhaps, or albums
Yeah.
that aren't known. I could go on forever, but some of the first ones that come to mind. I was a big fan of an album by a band called Heaven's Edge. I don't know if you ever heard of them. They had a self-titled debut in 1990. This was a perfect example of the saturation effect I was talking about. For those who have heard the album, it had every component that would be needed to have a platinum album, right? It had the songs, it had this amazing virtuoso guitar player, it had a charismatic, talented frontman. It had the look, it had the big power ballad, it had the rock songs, it had a mid-tempo song called Find Another Way. There's no reason that album shouldn't have sold a million copies, just the same as an album from Slaughter or Firehouse at the time. But there was just so much out there. Like I said, the man couldn't keep up with the supply. That album didn't even go gold, but it was one of my favorites at the time. If you're a fan of this genre of music, go find it. Heaven's Edge. I've always thought some bands that were maybe on the periphery of what you would consider hair metal. I personally don't consider any of these bands hair metal, but again, we're all homogenizing here. But bands like the Electric Boys or the London Choir Boys, I thought they had some great records that weren't, as known as other things. Brittany Fox, the record they did with their new singer after Davison left, they did the Bite Down Hard record. I thought that was terrific. Didn't get a lot of sales. For the more casual fan, Winger's Pole album, I thought was really underrated, was really terrific. Bang Tango's Love After Death album, again, another album that didn't get a release in the US. Some of their best work was on that album. Mr. Big, right? Everybody knew, Mr. Big from To Be With You, but they did an album in the mid 90s called Lean Into It. Excuse me, Hey Man. Lean Into It was with To Be With You, but Hey Man was a great album. So there's lots of stuff out there, most of it coming from that mid 90s period that, if the casual fans out there go back and check it out and rediscover it, there's some really good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, is there anything you'd like to add about the book?
Uh, No, I mean, like I said, anyone listening to this show pretty much probably knows what they're getting. But if you're a fan of the genre and you've always wanted to know some things about, the making of the music or some of the, the backstage stories that didn't make it into the Metal Edge magazine, hopefully I've got some of that in there for people. And if they just want a real comprehensive narrative about how this whole thing went up, came down and then came back. Hopefully I've done an adequate job of putting the pieces together, or even if they just want a trip down, memory lane and some good nostalgia. A lot of people are very kind and they write me and say, hey, I read about, this album or this band in the book and I never heard of them. And I went back and I picked up their music and, I can't believe I missed them at the time. So hopefully it's good for some stuff like that. But like I said, I wrote it as a fan. I wrote it for other fans. So I just hope people enjoy it.
Now, do you have any other books that you're thinking about writing down the road at all, or anything you can share?
Yeah, actually, I don't know when anything will or won't come out. Like I said, these things are huge time consumers. But I recently started a book called The Curious Case of the 80s Hard Rock and Heavy Metal Power Ballads. I'll have to fine tune that title. But basically, the concept behind it is the unique nature of the fact that we talk about all these hair bands and for the most part, the image and the lifestyle, these were bad boys, right? And this was rock and roll heavy metal music. But if you take like 8 out of 10 of these bands, maybe even 9 out of 10, and you look at their biggest charting single, they're all power ballads, right? And the power ballad is not necessarily the musical format these folks were known for. So I think it's kind of ironic that they all scored their success with a type of music that was not in line with the type of music they cut their teeth on or that they got into it with. And there's all kinds of nuances behind that. Some of them did it because you had to. If you wanted a platinum record, well, you needed a power ballad, at least in 1989. Others, had that incorporated into the toolkit to begin with. And so it just takes a little deeper dive into that whole concept of, how did we get this scenario where all these bad boys, with the long hair and the partying, were making all their money on power ballads? So I don't know if that's interesting to anybody, but if it works out in anything decent, I'll put it out there, probably for free.
Gee, okay. All right. Well, it was great having you on here for this segment here, and maybe down the road we'll bring you back and do some ranking. Maybe we'll do like a hairband top 10 all-time ranking albums. That should be interesting.
I would love to do that. Always a lot of fun.
Yes, definitely. All right. Well, thank you for coming on board, and we'll talk to you soon.